The morning Emmett Carey walked into the most intimidating job interview of his life, he was wearing the only clean dress shirt he owned, carrying a folder of references. He was fairly certain nobody was going to read and operating on 4 hours of sleep because his daughter had had a nightmare about wolves at 1:45 in the morning and needed him until the wolves agreed to leave, which they did not do quickly. He was not by any reasonable measure the most competitive candidate for the position of live-in nanny to the 3 children of one of the most powerful women in Seattle. He was a 36-year-old single father with a background in early childhood education, a modest resume that included a master's degree. Nobody in the childcare industry seemed to pay extra for, and a specific set of skills he had built over 8 years of daily practice, for reasons that had nothing to do with professional advancement and everything to do with the fact that the person he loved most in the world communicated partly through her hands, and he had decided before she was 3 months old that he would meet her there completely. The other candidates he saw in the waiting room before his interview were younger, more polished, and several of them appeared to have prepared portfolios with laminated dividers and color-coded tabs. He had a manila folder and a coffee stain on his left sleeve that he had noticed in the elevator and was hoping nobody else would notice, though he suspected the woman across from him with the pristine blazer and the European leather bag had already cataloged it. What he also had, what none of those other candidates had, what nobody in that office building knew. He had what was about to change the trajectory of 2 families in ways that neither family could have predicted, was the ability to walk into a room with 3 5-year-old triplets who had not engaged with a single nanny candidate in 6 weeks of interviews and within 4 minutes make all 3 of them laugh at the same time. But that moment had not arrived yet. That moment was still 40 minutes away, sitting on the other side of a door he had not yet been called through, and before it could arrive the full picture needed to exist. Because without the full picture, what happened in that room was just a surprising moment rather than the thing it actually was, which was the collision of 2 families who needed each other in ways neither of them had the language to articulate until the language literally showed up. His name was Emmett, and he was 36 years old, and this is where his story begins. Though it begins as the best stories usually do in a place that has nothing to do with where it ends. Juniper Carey was 8 years old. Everyone called her Junie, except her pediatric audiologist, who called her Juniper with the careful enunciation of someone who had been trained to model clear speech, and the woman at the grocery store deli counter who called her Jellybean for reasons Junie had never questioned, and Emmett had never corrected because some things are better left in the uncomplicated territory of affection. Junie had bilateral hearing loss identified at birth, a diagnosis that had arrived in a hospital room when Emmett was 28 years old and holding a newborn, and understanding for the first time that the distance between what you expect your life to be and what it actually is can close in a single sentence from a doctor whose name you will never forget. The audiologist had explained it calmly. Sensorineural, bilateral, moderate to severe. The words had landed in Emmett's chest like stones dropped into still water, each one sending out its own ring of implication, and he had stood in that hospital room holding his daughter and understanding that everything he had assumed about how he would communicate with his child, every lullaby he had imagined singing, every bedtime story he had planned to whisper, every casual conversation he had taken for granted as the inevitable background noise of parenthood, was going to require reimagining. He had enrolled in American Sign Language classes when Junie was 3 months old. He had practiced with a commitment that was by his own admission slightly obsessive, though he preferred the word thorough, because when the person you are most responsible for in the world communicates partly through a language you do not yet speak, you do not approach learning that language casually. You approach it the way you approach anything that matters completely, which is with everything you have for as long as it takes, and then you keep going after that because fluency is not a destination, it is a practice, and the practice does not end. By the time Junie was 2, their apartment was genuinely bilingual, spoken English and American Sign Language, running through every room like 2 rivers sharing the same valley. By the time she was 5, she had outpaced him in expressiveness and fluency in the specific way that children always outpace the adults who taught them, which Emmett found simultaneously humbling and deeply satisfying. Because the whole point of teaching someone a language is that they eventually speak it better than you do. And if that bothers you, you were never teaching for the right reasons. Junie wore hearing aids that gave her solid access to speech in most environments, but in loud or acoustically complex settings the aids were less reliable, and from the beginning of her life Emmett had made a decision that they were not going to rely on a single mode of communication. They were going to be bilingual, both languages complete, both daily, both treated as equally valid expressions of who they were. She was a beautiful signer. It was one of the things he was most proud of in his life, not the signing itself, but the decision to give it to her fully without reservation as something she deserved to have completely. Uni lived with Emmett full-time. Her mother, Anna Brennan, his college girlfriend at the University of Washington, had taken a position with a biomedical consulting firm in Boston 4 years earlier. And while she and Junie maintained a genuine and warm long-distance relationship through video calls every Sunday and a 2-week visit every summer, the daily reality of Junie's life was Emmett. The school runs and the medical appointments and the homework battles and the nightmares about wolves and the Saturday morning pancakes and the 8 years of accumulated ordinary moments that constitute a childhood. He would not trade any of it, including the parts that were hard, and the parts that were hard were real. Single-parenting a child with hearing loss on a childcare worker's salary in Seattle, which was not a cheap city even before the housing market decided to lose its collective mind, was a logistical and financial navigation that required creativity and planning on a daily basis, and on some days required something closer to prayer. The apartment was the current crisis. The building had been sold to a development company that intended to demolish it and construct what the notice taped to his door described as luxury mixed-use residences, which was a phrase that meant nothing to Emmett except that he and Uni had 60 days to find somewhere else to live. 60 days. In Seattle, on a childcare worker's salary, with a bank account that currently held $1,247 and a savings account that held the kind of number you do not say out loud because saying it makes it more real than you are prepared to deal with on a Tuesday. He had looked at rental listings the previous night after Uni was asleep scrolling through numbers that made his stomach tighten, and he had closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen and done the thing he always did when the financial math stopped working, which was to remind himself that the math had stopped working before, and he had figured it out before, and he would figure it out again. And then he had washed the dishes, because washing the dishes was a problem he could solve immediately. And sometimes you need a solvable problem to keep you steady, while the unsolvable ones circle. The job posting had appeared on a childcare professional network that Emmett subscribed to, sandwiched between a part-time preschool aide position in Tacoma and a weekend babysitting gig that paid $14 an hour and required a background in Mandarin, which he did not have. He had scrolled past it, then scrolled back. Live-in nanny position. 3 children. American Sign Language fluency required genuine fluency rather than basic conversational level. The salary was listed, and it was a number that made Emmett set his coffee down and read the posting again from the beginning because he was fairly certain he had misread it. He had not misread it. The salary was nearly 3 times what he currently earned, and the live-in component meant that the housing problem, the most immediate and most pressing of his current crises, would simply cease to exist. He had read it a 3rd time, then a 4th. He had looked at the organization-listed Langford Meridian, and his eyebrows had risen, because even a man who paid very little attention to business news knew that name. He had looked at the name of the employer, Catherine Langford, and his eyebrows had risen further because he had seen that face in magazines at the dentist's office and in the kind of newspaper coverage that is given to people who have built something genuinely significant and who look in their photographs like they have organized every element of their existence with the precision of someone who does not tolerate inefficiency in any form. She had triplets, 3 5-year-old children named Theo, Margot, and Ren, all 3 profoundly deaf since birth, due to a genetic condition that had not been detected until the children were born. The posting mentioned this directly with language that was careful and thorough, and spoke to someone who had been through a significant number of disappointing interviews and wanted to waste no one's time, least of all her own. Candidates with ASL experience were strongly preferred. The successful candidate would need to demonstrate genuine fluency, rather than the casual conversational signing that many candidates apparently claimed and few actually possessed. And then there was the detail that stopped him. The posting noted in a way that Emmett found both striking and deeply familiar that the children had not spoken to or engaged with any of the previous nanny candidates. 6 weeks of interviews. The children had sat through each one in silence, the particular silence of children who have learned that the adults in front of them do not have the language to reach them, and had waited for each interview to end without connecting with anyone. 6 weeks. 16 candidates. 3 5-year-olds sitting through every single one in polite, patient, complete silence. Emmett had read that sentence and set the laptop down and sat very still for a moment because something in his chest had shifted, something that had nothing to do with the salary or the housing crisis or any of the practical considerations that had brought him to the posting in the first place. He was thinking about Uni at 3 years old. He was remembering a specific afternoon in the pediatric audiologist's waiting room when she had been watching the other children talk to their parents with an expression he had learned to recognize over the years. Not sad, not angry, just patient, the quiet patience of someone who understands that not everyone can reach them and has made an early peace with that. And the memory of that expression on his daughter's 3-year-old face connected immediately and without any intellectual mediation to the image of 3 5-year-olds sitting through 16 interviews wearing the same expression, and the connection hurt in the way that only recognition hurts when you see your own child's experience reflected in someone else's children and you understand it from the inside. He applied on a Wednesday evening after Uni was asleep, telling himself he was unlikely to get an interview and trying to manage his own expectations with the specific internal negotiation of a person who needs something to work out and is trying very hard not to want it too much, because wanting things too much is how you get destroyed when they do not happen. He got the call for an interview 4 days later, and then the night before the interview something happened that Emmett had not anticipated and that he would think about for years afterward as the moment the story actually began. He was at the kitchen table reviewing his notes, which were mostly reminders about the children's specific developmental needs that he had researched thoroughly in the 4 days since getting the call. He had made additional notes about the particular considerations of raising deaf children in a hearing family context because this was something he knew not from academic literature but from inside the experience, and he wanted to be precise about what he would say if asked. Uni was supposed to be asleep. She was not asleep. She was standing in the hallway in her pajamas with the dogs on them watching him, and when he looked up she walked over to the table and looked at his notes and then looked at him. Her hands moved. Quick, fluid, the signing of someone who has been doing this her entire life and for whom it is not a second language but a first one, running alongside spoken English like a parallel river. She asked what he was studying. He explained. A job. Taking care of 3 kids who were deaf like her, 5 years old, triplets. Juni's eyes widened. She asked if they could sign. He told her yes, they could sign, but they had been meeting grown-ups for 6 weeks, and none of the grown-ups could sign well enough to talk to them, so the kids had been sitting in silence. Uni processed this. Her face did the thing it did when she was working through something that mattered to her, a slight narrowing of the eyes and a tightening of the lips that made her look approximately 47 years old. And then she signed something that Emmett would carry with him into the interview the next morning, like a stone in his pocket, smooth and heavy and grounding. She signed, "They are waiting for you, Dad. You have to go. Not you should go. Not it would be nice if you went. You have to go." The imperative of an 8-year-old who understood something about waiting in silence that most adults never learn, because she had done it herself, because she knew what it felt like to be in a room where nobody could reach you, and she was not willing to let 3 5-year-olds sit in that room one day longer than necessary if her father could do something about it. Emmett looked at his daughter, this 8-year-old person who continued to be, without exaggeration or parental bias, one of the most interesting and perceptive human beings he had ever encountered at any age, and he signed back, "What if I'm not what they need?" Juni's response was immediate. Her hands didn't hesitate. "You taught me. You're what they need." He had carried that sentence into the elevator of the Langford Meridian building the next morning. He was carrying it when he noticed the coffee stain. He was carrying it when he sat down in the waiting room across from the woman with the pristine blazer. He was carrying it when Garrett Holland's Catherine Langford's assistant, a calm and methodical man who had clearly been managing this process for 6 weeks and had developed the professional equanimity of someone who has witnessed a great deal of disappointment and has learned to expect more of it, came out and called his name third in the sequence and led him down a hallway toward the room where everything was about to change. The room was large and warmly furnished, clearly designed to be a child-friendly space within an otherwise corporate environment. There were picture books on low shelves and soft furniture arranged in a loose semicircle, and a table scaled to small bodies with art supplies spread across it in the organized chaos that indicated children who used the supplies regularly and had opinions about where things belonged. And at that table, sitting with the self-contained patience that Emmett had read about in the posting and had been thinking about ever since, were 3 children. Theo was on the left. a quiet boy with sandy brown hair and the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read a room before committing to it, who watches the way people move and the way their faces change before deciding whether the environment is safe enough to offer anything of himself. He was holding a blue crayon but was not drawing. He was waiting. Margot was in the middle. She had her mother's precise posture and a watchfulness in her expression that reminded Emmett immediately of Junie, at the same age, that specific quality of visual attention that children who rely on their eyes to gather information develop early and never lose the habit of watching everything because everything might be important and you cannot afford to miss it. Wren was on the right, smallest of the three, with her hands resting on the table in the ready, slightly poised position of someone for whom the hands are the primary instrument of communication and who keeps them available the way a musician keeps an instrument close. She had freckles across her nose and an expression that suggested she had things to say and was waiting with diminishing patience for someone to show up who could hear them. Catherine Langford was seated to the side in a chair positioned to observe without dominating the room. She was exactly as she appeared in the photographs Emmett had seen, composed, precise, the specific containment of someone who has built something requiring enormous sustained effort and has organized every element of herself accordingly. She wore a gray silk blouse and her hair was pulled back and her posture communicated authority even in stillness, but there was something underneath the authority that Emmett recognized because he had learned to read people the way his daughter had learned to read rooms carefully and out of necessity. And what he saw underneath Catherine Langford's composure was exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, the deeper kind. The exhaustion of someone who has been watching her children sit in silence for 6 weeks and has reached the point where hope is more expensive than she can afford, and she has stopped spending it. She introduced herself with efficient brevity. The format was simple. 15 minutes with the children, then a separate conversation with her. She delivered this information with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has given the same speech 16 times and has learned not to invest anything in the delivery because investment implies expectation, and expectation has been a poor strategy. Emmett thanked her. He set his folder of references on a side table where it would remain untouched for the rest of the afternoon. And then he turned toward the children's table and he crouched down to their eye level, which was something he did automatically because 8 years of communicating with a deaf child teaches you that eye level is not a courtesy but a necessity. It is the foundation of every conversation, and he raised his hands. He signed, "Hi. My name is Emmett. I really like your table. Can I sit with you?" 3 pairs of eyes locked onto his hands with the sudden absolute focus of children who have been waiting for exactly this and have almost stopped believing it was going to arrive. Theo's head came up from its studied downward angle. Margot leaned forward. And Wren, who Emmett would learn was the fastest signer of the 3 and the most expressive, and the one whose patience for non-signing adults had worn thinnest, signed back immediately with the speed and emphasis of someone who has been holding a door shut against a flood of accumulated words and has just been given permission to open it. She signed, "You know sign language, not a question, a statement, an identification. You are the thing we have been waiting for. You are the person who can reach us." Emmett signed back, "I do. My daughter Junie has hearing loss. We sign every day. Can I sit?" Wren pulled out the chair next to her and pointed at it with an authority that was absolute and completely charming, and also underneath the charm quietly devastating because the authority of a 5-year-old who has been waiting 6 weeks to offer someone a chair is not the same as ordinary authority. It is the authority of someone who has learned that offering is risky, because most people cannot accept what you are offering and who is offering anyway, because the alternative is to stop offering, and she is 5 years old and not ready to stop. He sat down. Theo signed first after Wren's opening. Cautious. Testing. He wanted to know how old Emmett's daughter was and whether she was better at signing than Emmett. Emmett signed that Junie was 8, and definitely yes, she was better than him, and he made a face of exaggerated defeat that made Theo cover his mouth with both hands to contain something that wanted to come out and had not come out in this room in 6 weeks, which was a laugh. Margot wanted to know what kind of art Emmett liked because there were art supplies on the table, and she had a clear position on the subject of art and wanted to understand his position before she would fully commit to the conversation. He told her honestly that he was decent at drawing buildings but terrible at drawing people, and that every animal he attempted to draw ended up looking like the same animal regardless of what animal he was aiming for. Margot found this deeply satisfying and signed same with the emphatic relief of someone who has discovered an unexpected peer in a field where she had assumed she was alone. Wren signed at a speed that was faster than either of her siblings, with the expressiveness of a born communicator who has spent 5 years assembling a vocabulary to contain everything she wanted to say and has found very few people capable of receiving it. She told Emmett about 3 different things in rapid succession. Her favorite book, which involved a rabbit who traveled by balloon. A disagreement she had recently had with Theo about a purple crayon that Emmett gathered had been significant and was not yet fully resolved. And the fact that she had a loose tooth and was expecting considerable compensation from the tooth fairy and wanted to know if Emmett had any current intelligence on the going rate. He signed that he believed the going rate had increased recently due to inflation, and then he paused because all 3 children were looking at him with matching expressions of delighted confusion, and he finger-spelled the word inflation slowly and explained that it meant everything costs more than it used to, including apparently teeth. 3 5-year-olds signed the word inflation in unison with the particular glee of children encountering a new word that sounds important and adult and slightly ridiculous, and the glee produced the specific moment. 3 simultaneous laughs from 3 children who had not laughed in this room in 6 weeks of interviews with 16 candidates who could not reach them. From the chair to the side, Catherine Langford made a sound. It was brief, involuntary, quickly contained. A short, sharp intake of breath that was not a gasp, but was adjacent to a gasp, the sound of someone who has been maintaining professional composure through 6 weeks of accumulating disappointment and has just been ambushed by something she was not prepared for and cannot process quickly enough to prevent the sound from escaping. Emmett glanced at her briefly and then looked back at the children, because the children were the thing that mattered, and he was not performing for anyone, but he registered her expression in that glance. The expression of a woman watching something she had stopped believing was going to happen happening. The expression of a mother who has been sitting 6 feet away from her children's silence for 6 weeks and is watching a stranger break it open in 4 minutes with the language she has been trying to learn for 18 months and has not yet mastered. And the expression contained something that Emmett recognized immediately because he knew what it looked like when a parent watched someone else give their child something the parent could not yet give. And it looked like gratitude and devastation in equal measure, held together by the thin structural engineering of composure that was not going to hold much longer. The 15 minutes ended. Garrett Hollins appeared at the door with the careful timing of someone who has done this 16 times. Emmett said goodbye to the children. Theo signed, "Come back," with the directness of someone who has made a decision and sees no reason to obscure it. Margot signed that Emmett could draw with them next time, if he wanted the conditional phrasing a thin disguise for what was clearly a requirement rather than an invitation. Wren signed something fast and emphatic that Emmett caught most of but not all of, and the part he caught was the word finally. He followed Garrett to a separate room. Catherine came in a few minutes later and sat across from him and was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to become its own kind of communication. Then she spoke, and her voice was composed and careful and carrying something underneath it that was neither composed nor careful, something that was fraying at the edges. Her children had not responded to anyone in 6 weeks. She needed to understand what had just happened. Emmett's answer was simple. What happened was that 3 children had been waiting for someone who could actually talk to them, and today that person walked through the door. Catherine absorbed this. She told him he was a single father. He told her about unibilateral hearing loss from birth, 8 years old, bilingual since before she could walk. Catherine was quiet again, the silence of someone assembling information and discovering that it changes the shape of what she thought she was looking at. Then she asked how he had learned to sign. Emmett gave her the only honest answer. He started because his daughter needed him to, and he kept going because stopping was never something he considered, because when the person you love most in the world speaks a language, you learn that language and you learn it completely. And you do not stop at conversational. You do not stop at good enough. You keep going until you can say everything that needs to be said, and then you keep going after that, because there is always more to say. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that rearranged the emotional architecture of the room. Her voice shifted the composure, thinning like ice over moving water, and what came through was not the CEO of a biotech company, but a mother who had been carrying something for 6 weeks that she could no longer carry in silence. She had started learning ASL 18 months ago when the diagnosis was confirmed. She had hired tutors and practiced daily and worked at it with the same discipline she brought to everything in her professional life. But she was not where she needed to be. Not yet. She could handle basic exchanges, simple requests, routine household signing, but she could not give her children what they needed in the language. Not fully. Not the way Emmett had just done, the effortless fluency, the jokes, the play, the natural conversational speed that made the children come alive. She could not do that. She was their mother, and she could not do it. And a stranger at their table had done it in 4 minutes, and she had been sitting with that specific failure for 6 weeks, watching candidate after candidate fail to reach her children, and knowing that she herself could not reach them either, not completely, not in the language they needed, and the accumulated weight of that knowledge was something she was telling him now because he had just changed the room, and she needed him to understand what the room had been before he changed it. Emmett looked at this woman, this CEO, this mother who had just laid down her armor in front of a man with a coffee stain on his sleeve, and he said the truest thing he knew. The 4 minutes she had just witnessed were built on 8 years of daily practice. She had 18 months. She was going to get there. The distance between where she was and where she needed to be was not permanent. It was just distance, and distance closes with effort and time and the specific stubbornness of a parent who refuses to accept that any barrier between herself and her children is final. Catherine asked if that was the professional assessment or the human one. Both, Emmett told her. Both. She offered him the position 3 days later. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while Junie and he were eating breakfast across from each other at the small kitchen table in the apartment they had 60 days to leave, and when he put the phone down after accepting, he looked at his daughter over the cereal bowls and signed to her, "We are going to be okay." Junie signed back without hesitation, with the calm certainty of an 8-year-old who has understood something about her father's capacity for problem-solving that her father has not yet fully understood about himself. "We were already okay, Dad." But the okay had a condition attached to it that Emmett did not learn about until his second phone call with Catherine that afternoon, the call in which logistics were discussed and details were specified, and the actual terms of the arrangement were laid out in the precise, thorough language of a woman who ran a corporation and did not leave ambiguity in her agreements. The position was live-in. Emmett would have a private suite on the second floor of the Langford residence. His hours would be structured around the children's schedule. The trial period was 30 days, at the end of which a formal evaluation would determine whether the arrangement would continue. These terms were clear and reasonable, and Emmett had expected all of them. What he had not expected was the last condition. Catherine delivered it without apology, in the tone of someone who has made a decision based on what she believes is necessary and is not interested in negotiating it. The position was for Emmett, not for Emmett and his daughter. The household was already complex, 3 5-year-olds with significant needs, a mother balancing a demanding career, a domestic infrastructure that required precision. Adding another child to that environment during a 30-day trial period was, in Catherine's assessment, inadvisable. Junie could not live with them. Emmett stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and felt the floor shift beneath him, in the particular way that it shifts when you realize that the solution you have found to one impossible problem has just created another impossible problem, and the second impossible problem involves your child, which makes it not just impossible but unbearable, because every parent knows that the only truly unbearable problems are the ones that land on your children. He asked for a day to think about it. Catherine gave him 24 hours. He spent those 24 hours doing math. Not financial math, though, that was part of it. The deeper math. The math of a single father calculating whether the distance between himself and his daughter, if measured in blocks rather than miles, and if filled with nightly phone calls and weekend visits, would be survivable for both of them, or whether it would crack something that could not be repaired. He called his friend Marcus, his closest friend from the early days of parenthood, a man who had sat with him in the hospital when Junie was born, and who had learned enough ASL to have basic conversations with her, and whose home was 3 miles from the Langford residence, and who said yes, without hesitation, when Emmett explained the situation, because that is what Marcus did. He said yes to the things that mattered without needing to think about it, which was a quality Emmett admired and had never been able to replicate because Emmett thought about everything extensively and sometimes to his own detriment. Junie would stay with Marcus. Emmett would see her every weekend. They would video call every night. It was temporary. 30 days. Then, if the position became permanent, they would renegotiate. He told himself these things in the specific cadence of a man constructing a bridge out of logic while standing on an emotional cliff, knowing that the bridge needs to hold, but not entirely certain that it will. He told Junie that evening. He signed it carefully, the way he signed everything important to her, with full eye contact and deliberate pacing, and the awareness that what he was about to communicate was going to land in a place that mattered, and he needed to be precise. He had gotten the job. He was going to live in the house with the 3 deaf children she had told him to go help. But for the first 30 days she would stay with Uncle Marcus. Not far. 3 miles. Every weekend together. Every night on video call. 30 days. Junie listened. She processed. Her face did the 47-year-old thing. And then she signed something that broke his heart and put it back together in the same motion, because that is what children do. They break you and mend you simultaneously and do not seem to notice they are doing either. She signed. The 3 kids need you more right now. I already had you for 8 years. They have had nobody. Emmett looked at his daughter. 8 years old. Telling her father to go take care of someone else's children because those children had been waiting longer than she had. He reached across the table and held her hands. The hands that had been his primary connection to her since she was a baby. The hands that signed "I love you" every night before bed. The hands that had just released him to go build something in another house while she waited in a house that was not her own. Everything he had built with those hands, every sign he had learned, every hour of practice, every moment of fluency achieved through repetition and patience, and the stubborn refusal to let any barrier between himself and his child remain standing, all of it had been for her. Every bit of it. And now all of it was about to walk through a door he could not have predicted into a room with 3 children who had been sitting in silence, and the thing that made it possible, the thing that opened the door, was not a credential or a qualification or anything on his resume. It was love. 8 years of it. Converted into a language. Carried into a room where it was desperately needed. And offered freely, without performance, without calculation, to 3 children who had been waiting for exactly this and had almost given up believing it would come. He packed a bag the next morning. He held Junie at the door of Marcus's house for longer than either of them expected. She pulled back and signed, "Tell the kids about inflation. They will think it is hilarious." He drove to the Langford residence with a suitcase in the back seat and his daughter's instructions in his chest, and the specific, terrifying, exhilarating feeling of a man who is about to step into a life he did not plan for and cannot fully see, and is choosing to trust that the skills he built for love will find their purpose in a place he never imagined they would be needed. The house was larger than he expected. The silence inside it was larger still. The first morning inside the Langford residence, Emmett woke at 5:45 to a silence that was different from anything he had known. His apartment silence had been small-shaped by the awareness that Junie was 12 feet away behind a thin wall. This silence was architectural, filling high ceilings and hallways and rooms he had not yet entered, with the accumulated weight of a family communicating at half capacity, a mother still learning to listen, and 3 children with more to say than anyone in their lives could fully receive. He unpacked into the second-floor suite, which was larger than the bedroom he and Junie had shared, and the additional space felt like subtraction rather than addition, because the square footage contained none of the evidence of his daughter's existence. No shoes by the door, no hearing aid case on the nightstand, no particular disorder generated by an 8-year-old as proof of life. He video-called Junie at 6:15. She was already awake at Marcus's house, eating toast. Her hearing aids and her composure assembled with the determination of a child who had decided to be brave. She signed that Marcus made weird toast. Emmett signed that all toast was fundamentally the same. She signed that this was incorrect and that he clearly did not understand toast at the level she did, and the small argument was a rope they both held across the distance. In the background, Marcus appeared, briefly signing a clumsy but earnest good morning to Junie, his hands forming the words with the careful imprecision of a man who had spent the past week watching ASL tutorials on his phone so that his best friend's daughter would not feel entirely stranded in his home, and the effort visible in his fumbling fingers was a kindness that Emmett noted and filed in the part of himself that tracked the people who showed up for his child without being asked. Downstairs, a woman named Pauline, who managed the domestic operations of the household, walked Emmett through the children's routines and the schedule that governed their days, which was color-coded and precise in a way that told him everything about Catherine Langford's approach to parenting, systematic and thorough, and built on the assumption that preparation could control for variables that were in reality uncontrollable. The children appeared at 7. They came downstairs together, a unit of 3 that moved with the coordinated awareness of siblings who have spent every moment of their lives in proximity. Theo first scanning the kitchen, his eyes finding Emmett and registering his presence without commitment. Then the boy did something unexpected. He walked to the block shelf in the corner, selected a single wooden block, carried it to the table, and pushed it slowly across the surface toward Emmett without signing a word. The block stopped against Emmett's coffee cup. Theo watched. The gesture was a test disguised as an offering, a 5-year-old's method of determining whether this new adult could read a communication that was not language but was adjacent to it. A question asked in wood and motion rather than hands and grammar. Do you understand things that are not said directly? Emmett picked up the block, examined it with theatrical seriousness, and placed it on top of his coffee cup like a lid. Theo's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Not yet. The preliminary seismic activity of a smile being considered. Margot entered second, carrying her sketchbook with proprietary care, and sat down without looking at Emmett, which he understood as engagement, rather than dismissal. The engagement of a child who processes the world through visual creation and was already rendering him into a form she could study. Wren arrived third, already signing before she was fully through the doorway. Her first communication directed at Emmett with the unfiltered immediacy of a child who had found a fluent receiver and refused to waste a syllable of access. She wanted to know if there had been any official response from the Tooth Fairy regarding the inflation inquiry. Emmett signed that bureaucratic processes among fairy-based institutions moved slowly, and Wren received this with the exasperated patience of someone who found institutional inefficiency tiresome but unsurprising. The first week established a rhythm built on immersion rather than instruction. ASL was not a subject, but an environment, the medium through which meals were discussed and stories told and disagreements conducted, the oxygen of the household. By the 4th day, Theo told Emmett a full story about a bird that could not fly and a turtle that could not swim, and their decision to start a business selling hats, and the narrative was unremarkable in its coherence, but extraordinary in its existence, because Theo had not offered a full story to any adult outside his family in months, and the offering was an act of trust so specific that Emmett had to concentrate on keeping his face in the configuration of genuine interest, rather than the configuration of a man whose throat was closing because a 5-year-old had just handed him something precious. Catherine observed from the margins. She left for Langford Meridian each morning and returned by 6, and in the window before bedtime she occupied a position Emmett came to recognize as characteristic, present but peripheral, watching the interactions with an expression that shifted over the first week from evaluation to something more painful. She signed with the children when she was home. How was your day? What did you eat? I love you. The grammar was accurate, the music was missing, and the children responded with the slight unconscious adjustment of people who know the conversation will operate within certain limits and have learned to keep their contributions inside those limits rather than test them, which is a form of accommodation that children perform without awareness and that devastates you once you recognize what it means. On the 6th night after the children were in bed, Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway while Emmett was sorting the next day's art supplies into the bins. Margot preferred arranging the colored pencils by spectrum because Margot had opinions about chromatic order, and honoring those opinions was a small act of respect that cost nothing and communicated everything. Catherine watched him organize her daughter's pencils and then asked the question that had been building for days. She wanted to know how long it had taken, not the grammar, the thing underneath, the fluency that made the children ignite. Emmett set down a green pencil. He told her the truth. Years. Daily immersion with a child who needed him fluent. Years of mistakes corrected by a toddler, years of choosing to sign when speaking would have been easier because the easy choice was not the right choice. Catherine's jaw tightened, the muscular tell of someone absorbing confirmation of what she feared, that the distance between her and her children's full language was measured not in months, but in years. She thanked him in the tone of a CEO concluding a briefing and left. The second week, Margaret Langford arrived. She came on a Thursday in a silver sedan parked with territorial precision, entered without knocking, and found Emmett on the living room floor reading a picture book in sign language, Wren in his lap, Theo leaning against his shoulder, Margot watching his hands. Margaret stopped in the doorway and performed a visible calculation, cataloging a reality she had not approved. Her first words were directed past Emmett to an invisible audience of shared perspective. She wanted to know who this man was and why he was on the floor with her grandchildren. She stayed 3 days. She addressed the children in spoken English slowly and at volume as if decibels could substitute for grammar, and the children responded with the patient tolerance of people who had learned that this particular adult operated in a limited mode. Wren on the second day signed to Emmett with the editorial precision of a 5-year-old art critic delivering a verdict. Grandma talks loud, but doesn't say anything. Emmett left the room to compose himself. Margaret left on Sunday. On the hall table she positioned a brochure from a cochlear implant center in Portland, children with devices behind their ears smiling beneath the tagline, "Hear Their World." Emmett looked at it for a long time because the possessive pronoun was doing specific ideological work suggesting the world belonged to hearing people and deaf children required surgical intervention to access it. The brochure disappeared the next morning. Neither he nor Catherine mentioned it, and the mutual silence was its own communication, an acknowledgement that the territory was live, and neither was ready to cross it. The third week brought the fracture. Wednesday night, bedtime routine complete. Theo arranged precisely under his covers Margot's sketchbook on the nightstand. Wren asleep with the instantaneous surrender of someone who spent every waking moment at full communicative intensity. Emmett's phone buzzed in the hallway. Uni's face appeared on the screen, and he knew before she signed a word from the configuration of features he had memorized across 8 years and thousands of goodnights that the composure had failed. She was crying. Not frustrated crying. The deep, quiet kind that comes when bravery reaches its expiration and the shelf it was stored on collapses. The kids at school were asking where her dad was. Marcus was nice, but his house smelled different, and the sheets were different, and the ceiling was different, and she could not sleep because the ceiling was different, and she knew it was stupid. But it was not stupid to her. It was the most real thing in her world. And she missed him in the specific way. You miss the person who is not just a parent, but your entire communication infrastructure, the one through whom everything makes sense. Emmett stood in the hallway signing reassurance into a 3-inch screen, signing love and soon and promise and I know, and every sign was true and every sign was insufficient because the sign for I love you is not the same as the physical presence of the person who loves you. Behind him a sound. He turned. Wren was standing in the Triplets' doorway, not asleep after all, watching his hands in the phone screen and the small crying face of a girl she had never met. Her expression was not curiosity, it was recognition. The recognition of one child who knows what it looks like when another child is missing someone. Because missing is a geography, she has mapped personally the territory between what you need and what is available. And she was looking at Uni with the specific solidarity of a resident of that territory encountering another. Wren signed small and slow, her hands moving with a gentleness that was unlike her usual velocity. Your daughter is sad. Yes, Emmett signed. Wren signed. You should go home to her. And the thing Emmett had been outrunning since the morning he packed his suitcase caught him in a hallway at 9:17 on a Wednesday, delivered by a 5-year-old telling him to leave because she understood what daughters need from fathers, the understanding sourced from her own unmet need, and the empathy was staggering, and the cost was that 2 children now required him in opposite directions, and he was one person with one body standing in between. He did not leave. He put Wren back to bed, signed her a story until she slept, then called Marcus and asked him to set the phone on Uni's pillow so she could see Emmett's face while she fell asleep. Marcus did, and Emmett sat in the dark watching his daughter drift off in a room that was not hers, while he occupied a room that was not his, 3 miles and an infinity apart. The 4th week he broke the rule. Catherine was in San Francisco for a board meeting. Pauline had a family emergency. Emmett drove to Marcus's house Saturday morning, picked up Junie, and brought her to the Langford residence. Uni walked into the playroom and signed hello with the fluency of someone who has carried the language her entire life. The triplets stared. Another child. A signing child. A child like them. Wren reached Uni first, unleashing the full torrent of communication she typically reserved for Emmett, and Uni matched it, and the two fell into conversation so fast and fluid and full of the specific joy of mutual discovery that Emmett had to sit down because the sight undid something held too tightly for too long. Theo asked Uni whether his bird and turtle hat business story was good. Uni considered this with gravity and told him the ending needed work. Theo received the editorial feedback with the dignity of an artist encountering constructive criticism. Margot showed Uni her sketchbook, the highest trust she offered anyone, and Uni studied each drawing and pointed to a cat and told her it was actually good, and Margot's posture shifted from guarded to open in the space of a single sentence. He drove Uni back that evening. She fell asleep in the car. When he carried her inside Marcus's house, she half woke and signed drowsy and certain, "They are my people, Dad." He brought her back the next weekend, and the one after. The second time, Catherine returned from a trip 4 hours early and walked into her own living room to find 4 children on the floor, building a city from blocks and cushions. Junie directing urban planning, Ren handling signage, Theo engineering structural supports, Margot designing aesthetics, and Emmett cross-legged in the center of it. And his eyes met Catherine's in the doorway, and he understood that the contract was no longer the operative document because he had violated it, and the evidence was 4 children who were radiantly happy. Catherine's voice was quiet and precise, the choice of precision over volume, because precision was more dangerous and she knew it. They had an agreement. The agreement was specific. His daughter was not part of it. Emmett signed to Uni to take the triplets to the playroom. Uni ate, and Perceptive gathered the 3 5-year-olds with the efficient authority of a child evacuating before a storm, and the 4 disappeared down the hall. Then Emmett stopped accommodating. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 4 weeks splitting himself between 2 sets of children and had reached the point where the split was a lie he would no longer maintain. He told her she had asked him to separate from his daughter to care for her children, and he understood why and did not blame her. Then his voice dropped not in volume but in register. She was doing the same thing, different method. She shared a house with her children and meals and goodnight kisses and was present in every physical dimension and still could not fully reach them. Not in their language, not at the depth they required, and the distance between her and her children was not measured in miles but in fluency, and she came home to that distance every night. Catherine did not respond. The silence was dense with the recognition that occurs when someone describes your wound accurately, and the accuracy is simultaneously an intrusion and a relief, and you cannot determine which to answer. When she spoke, the CEO was gone. Something behind the composure had shifted, a door opening 1 inch in a sealed wall. She asked if Uni was happy today. All 4 children were happy, Emmett told her. The house had been full of language for the first time since he arrived, and the fullness was the thing she had been hiring 16 candidates to create, and none had created, and he had not created alone either, because the missing element was not a skilled adult, but a child who could show 3 other children that their way of being in the world was shared, and that child was in the playroom. Catherine walked past him down the hallway to the playroom door and stood watching 4 children through the gap. She watched a long time. When she turned back, her composure was technically intact the way a dam is technically intact in the moment before it isn't. Her voice cracked on the first word and recovered on the second. She told Emmett to bring Uni to live in the house. Full time. Immediately. Uni moved in 2 days later. The reconfiguration was tectonic. 4 children in a home where sign language became the primary current of existence. Theo and Uni developed a fierce, competitive, loyal friendship. Margot found in Uni the first person who studied her drawings with genuine attention. Ren and Uni circled each other for 4 days before declaring a bond that was instant, absolute, and permanent. And then 6 weeks into the arrangement, the architecture collapsed from 2 directions simultaneously. Margaret called Catherine. Emmett heard fragments from the kitchen. Margaret had scheduled cochlear implant consultations in Portland for all 3 children without Catherine's knowledge or consent. She had contacted Langford Meridian board members framing concerns about Catherine's leadership stability in the language of corporate governance. The message was clear: comply with Margaret's vision and remove Emmett, or Margaret would use her 19% shareholding to call an extraordinary meeting challenging Catherine's fitness to lead. 40 minutes later, Emmett's phone rang. Boston area code. Anna's voice carried the specific tension of someone operating in fear and fury simultaneously. She wanted to know why their daughter was living in a stranger's home with 3 children Anna had never been told about in an arrangement made without her consent. She wanted Emmett to know she had purchased a plane ticket and would arrive in 4 days and expected to find an acceptable situation, or she would be contacting her attorney about custody. Emmett stood in the kitchen. Through the doorway, Junie and Wren were curled on the couch, signing rapidly, producing periodic bursts of silent laughter. Theo was showing Margot a new structure. 4 children in the configuration they were meant to hold, the shape perfect, and it was about to be torn apart from 2 directions by 2 women acting from genuine love, whose genuine love was aimed like wrecking balls at every wall he had built. He put the phone down. He looked at the children. He looked toward Catherine's study, where a woman sat with threats to both her family and her company. And he felt the vertiginous helplessness of a man at the intersection of forces larger than himself, a grandmother's ideology and a mother's fear and a corporation's governance and a custody agreement's weight, all converging on this house and these children and this fragile, necessary, irreplaceable thing constructed from nothing but language and love and the willingness to show up. The children were signing. Everything was about to break. The 4 days before Anna's arrival moved with the compressed intensity of a countdown, each one carrying more weight than a day should hold, and Emmett spent them doing the only thing he knew how to do when the structural integrity of his life was failing, which was to keep showing up completely for the people in front of him while the ground beneath him shifted. He made breakfast. He signed stories. He mediated the ongoing territorial dispute between Wren and Theo about a set of colored pencils that had evolved from a disagreement into something closer to a philosophical position that neither party intended to abandon. He held the routine in place with his hands because his hands were the most reliable part of him, and the routine was the scaffolding that kept 4 children feeling safe while the adults in their lives navigated a crisis. The children could not see, but could absolutely sense, because children are seismographs. They detect tremors that haven't reached the surface yet, and all 4 of them were quieter that week in the way that children get quiet when they know the weather is changing and are waiting to see what kind of storm arrives. On the second afternoon, Wren fell at the playground. The children were on the structure behind the house, the wooden climbing frame that Catherine had commissioned when the triplets turned 4, and Wren was at the top doing the thing Wren always did at the top, which was signing to anyone within eyeline about whatever was currently occupying the full bandwidth of her 5-year-old attention, and because her hands were signing instead of holding, she missed the rail. The fall was short, 4 feet onto rubber matting, and the injury was minor, a scraped elbow and a bump on the back of her head that would bruise but not concuss. But the fall was not the thing. The thing was the aftermath. Wren hit the ground, and the shock broke through whatever composure a 5-year-old possesses, and what came out was not a cry, because Wren's cries were silent, but a full-body panic that was louder than any sound could have been, arms reaching, face contorted, the absolute terror of a small person who has been hurt and needs the specific reassurance that only trusted hands can provide. Emmett was beside her in seconds. He did not speak because speaking was useless. He signed close to her face so she could see through the tears, slow and calm and steady. "You are okay. I am here. Show me where it hurts." The signs were a scaffold around her panic, giving it structure, giving it edges, containing it inside a language she could hold on to, and Wren's hands found his and gripped them with a force that was disproportionate to her size and proportionate to her fear, and she did not let go. Not when he carried her inside. Not when he cleaned the scrape. Not when he pressed ice wrapped in a dish towel against the bump. Her fingers stayed locked around his with the specific tenacity of a child who has found the person who can reach her in a crisis and is not willing to release that person for any reason, including the logistical inconvenience of the person needing both hands to apply a bandage. Catherine arrived 40 minutes later, called by Pauline. She came through the front door still wearing her work blazer, the CEO's armor not yet removed, and she found Emmett on the couch with Wren curled against him. Wren's hand still wrapped around 2 of his fingers, and Wren was calm now. The panic subsided, signing with her free hand about the rabbit book she wanted him to read. The fall already metabolized into story, which is what children do with trauma when they are held through it adequately. They convert it from experience into narrative, and the narrative gives them power over it. Catherine stood in the doorway. She did not enter immediately. She watched. And what she saw Emmett understood in the way he understood most things about Catherine by this point, which was through observation rather than conversation, was not her employee comforting her daughter. It was the specific image of a parent, not a nanny, not a caregiver, not a professional, performing a contractual obligation, but a parent, The person Wren reached for when the world became frightening, the person whose hands she trusted to contain her panic and to tell her in the language she thought in that the panic would pass. Catherine saw this, and something in the way she stood in the doorway shifted a weight, redistributing a structural recalculation that would not produce its result for another 2 days, but that began in this moment, watching her daughter hold a man's hand with the grip of someone who has decided where safety lives and does not intend to negotiate about it. Catherine and Emmett spoke that evening, not in the kitchen, not in the hallway, but in her study door, closed the conversation given the gravity it required. Catherine sat behind her desk, the desk as barrier, the CEO's instinct to put structure between herself and vulnerability. Neither of them pretended the situation was manageable. Catherine laid out the Margaret problem with clinical precision. Margaret held 19% of Langford Meridian. She had relationships with 3 of 7 board members predating Catherine's leadership. She had framed her concerns as fiduciary rather than personal, giving them corporate legitimacy. The framing was deliberate. Margaret had not built a fortune by being imprecise about leverage. Emmett asked the question. The analysis was designed to avoid the one underneath the spreadsheets. He asked what Margaret actually wanted, not the corporate objective, the human one. Catherine answered with a rawness that surprised both of them. Her mother wanted the children fixed. That was Margaret's word. 3 deaf grandchildren were a problem modern medicine could solve, and choosing not to solve it was parental failure. Margaret did not hate ASL or deaf culture. She simply could not see them. They existed outside the boundaries of the world she understood, and rather than expand boundaries, she wanted to bring the children inside existing ones. And the tool was a surgical implant, and the cost of the tool was its message that the children as they were, the language they thought in the silence they inhabited as home rather than absence, was insufficient. Emmett told her what he knew from inside 8 years of the same argument. Cochlear implants were not wrong, they were a tool. Some families used them and thrived, but the decision had to come from understanding rather than shame, from assessment of specific children rather than a belief that deafness was deficit, and if Margaret's argument was built on deficit, then no corporate leverage could make it right. Catherine asked what she should do, and the asking was not the CEO consulting a specialist but a mother turning to the only person who understood the exact coordinates of her situation. Emmett told her to talk to her children, in sign language, about anything. Because the answer to Margaret's challenge was not corporate counter-strategy, it was a mother who could communicate fully with her children, and every hour spent building that fluency was an hour constructing an argument no shareholder vote could dismantle. Catherine said something that landed with the weight of confession. She was afraid, not of Margaret. She was afraid she would never get there, that fluency would remain beyond reach, that she would spend years and still be the mother who caught the basics but missed the jokes, could not follow Wren's velocity or receive Theo's careful stories. Falling short of your own children is a species of failure that sharpens with effort rather than diminishing, because each improvement reveals how far remains. Emmett leaned forward, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who has lived through the thing described. Being afraid of never reaching your children is the thing that guarantees you will reach them, because the parents who fail are the ones who stop being afraid, who settle for good enough, who let the gap become permanent. The fear is not weakness, it is the engine. Catherine held his gaze. One nod, the nod of someone who has received what she needed and requires no further discussion, because discussion would dilute the clarity. Anna Brennan arrived in Seattle on Saturday morning. Emmett met her at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill neutral territory, the conversation requiring the discipline of a public setting. Anna was 35, sharp-featured, dressed with the practicality of a woman who had packed for confrontation rather than vacation. The first 20 minutes were adversarial. Their daughter moved into a stranger's home without Anna's consent, the arrangement entangled in ways that raised questions about judgment. Her information source unnamed, but clearly Margaret had described instability. Emmett did not defend. He let the fear speak itself out. Then he told her the story. 3 children silent for 6 weeks. A posting he almost skipped. An 8-year-old who told him he had to go. The interview, the inflation joke, the sound Catherine made when her children laughed. The Wednesday night Uni cried, and a 5-year-old named Wren stood in a doorway and told him to go home because even she could recognize what a father's absence costs a daughter. the day 4 children discovered each other. The sentence Uni signed from Marcus's guest bed. "They are my people, Dad." Anna's coffee cooled untouched. Her expression shifted in increments, fear receding not through refutation but through replacement. The recognition that Margaret's version was not the version that had actually happened, and the actual version was larger and more necessary than anything she had imagined on the flight from Boston. Emmett gave her the only thing that could settle what remained. "Come to the house, not to inspect, just to see Uni in it. Then decide based on what you see, rather than what you were told." They drove together in near silence. Anna sat in the driveway looking at a house that was nothing like the apartment where they had brought Uni home 8 years ago. Whatever she felt about that contrast, she kept in the register where co-parents store the things they choose not to say. Inside the living room, Uni and Wren were on the floor signing at a speed that was breathtaking, hands moving with the synchronized fluency of two people who have found their conversational match. Wren was telling a story within a story, her entire body recruited as language, and Uni was co-creating, adding details, challenging plot points, laughing silently at something that existed only between their hands. Theo and Margot were collaborating on a drawing of a city populated by animals in formal attire. Each suggestion debated in sign language with the absolute seriousness of people for whom the imaginary world carries the same consequence as the physical one. Anna stood in the doorway. Her hand went to her mouth. Uni looked up, saw her mother. Her face opened sudden and complete, and she crossed the room signing before she reached the doorway, fast and urgent. She signed "Mom, watch this," and turned and signed something to Wren, and Wren signed back, and the exchange produced the collapse of shared laughter, and Uni turned to her mother with the expression of a child presenting evidence that this place, these people, this language at full volume was the thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Wren stood next to Uni and looked up at Anna with evaluative directness. She signed to Uni. "Is this your mom? Does your mom know sign language?" Anna raised her hands. Slow, careful, effortful. She signed, "Hello, I am Uni's mom." The signs were correct but unhurried, careful footsteps on unfamiliar terrain. And Wren, who withheld patience from adults who signed below her speed, did something so small and so generous that Emmett felt his chest crack along a fault line he had not known existed. Wren slowed down. She matched Anna's pace. She signed back word by word, giving Anna the thing she needed most, not to be tested or evaluated, but to be met where she was in the language at the speed she could manage by a 5-year-old who understood from her own experience what it felt like when the language moved faster than you could follow, and who chose to slow down so this adult could keep up. Anna crouched. She signed to Wren with everything she felt carried in imperfect grammar. "You are very kind. Thank you." Wren signed back at Anna's speed with a formality that was simultaneously 5 years old and ancient. "You are welcome. Your daughter is my best friend." Emmett turned away because the moment did not belong to him and his face could not be trusted. Anna stayed 3 hours. She sat on the floor, signed what she could, watched what she couldn't, let Uni translate the rest. The translating became a game. Uni performing exaggerated professionalism as interpreter. The triplets laughing, the house filled with the sound of children who are completely safe and have no reason to hold anything back. Walking to the car, Anna did not speak for 2 minutes. Then her voice came raw, stripped of armor. She was not filing for custody. Uni was where she needed to be. She would come monthly, not quarterly, and learn ASL with the commitment she should have brought years ago. She looked at Emmett with the honesty of someone admitting failure, without asking absolution, only the chance to do better. Anna signed one sentence as she got in the car, the only one she delivered with full fluency, practiced on the flight, in case she needed it, intended as accusation, delivered as benediction. She signed, "She is where she belongs." Catherine faced Margaret at Langford Meridian headquarters in the boardroom rather than the living room because the boardroom was hers. She brought evidence. Developmental assessments from the children's speech-language pathologist. Video comparisons before and after Emmett's arrival. Pediatric audiologist reports documenting milestones that had stalled for months and accelerated dramatically since a fluent signer entered the household, including documentation that Margaret had scheduled cochlear implant consultations in Portland without parental consent, a fact that reframed Margaret's intervention from concerned grandmother to someone overriding a mother's medical authority. The evidence was the frame. The substance came after. Catherine looked at her mother across the table, and spoke not as CEO to shareholder, but daughter to mother. Her children were not broken. Their deafness was not deficiency. Their language was not a crutch. The choice to raise them in ASL was not concession to limitation, but commitment to wholeness. The commitment was hers, not Margaret's. Margaret cited shareholder provisions the extraordinary meeting she could convene. Catherine told her she had spent 3 days contacting every board member presenting evidence, asking each to consider how a grandmother using corporate governance to override a mother's medical decisions would appear to shareholders, press, and the biotech community. 5 of 7 had confirmed in writing they would not support Margaret's motion. Margaret left the boardroom without conceding, but the lever she had reached for was disconnected. Catherine stood alone and allowed herself 10 seconds of something quieter than triumph, the cost of a boundary that should have been drawn months ago. That evening changed the final shape of everything. Catherine came home early. The 4 children were at the dinner table. Catherine sat down. Theo turned to his mother and began signing about a substitute teacher who had attempted the word February with catastrophic results. The retelling was detailed and funny and structurally sophisticated, and Theo was signing at his natural speed, the full speed he used with Emmett and Uni, not the reduced speed he had always used with his mother. Catherine followed. Her face tracked the story. When the payoff arrived, Catherine laughed. Not the delayed laugh of deciphering. The immediate, involuntary, perfectly timed laugh of someone who understood the joke at the speed it was delivered, in the language it was delivered in, without translation or lag or effort. She laughed, and Theo laughed, and the shared laughter was a bridge proof of mutual understanding, evidence that 2 people inhabited the same moment at the same speed. The table paused. Catherine's eyes found Emmett across the dinner table. Emmett signed, "We are going to be okay." Catherine's hands rose, fluid, unhesitating, carrying the music of someone who had crossed from studying a language to living in it. She signed, "We already are." Emmett knew those words. Uni had said them at the breakfast table the morning he accepted this job. Catherine had just signed them back, and Emmett had never taught her that phrase. The only person who could have was Uni, his 8-year-old daughter, passing forward the sentence. Catherine needed it the moment. She needed it the way children give what they know to the adults who need it, quietly, without ceremony, in the generosity of someone loved well enough to have something to give. 3 years later. Theo, Margot, and Ren were 8, the age Uni had been when the story began. Uni was 11, taller than expected, funnier than Emmett was prepared for, more capable of surprising him than he would have thought possible given that he had known her for her entire life. But that is the nature of children. They are constructed from materials you provide, and they build something you did not design, and the building is the point. She taught a weekend ASL class at the Carrie Langford Family Communication Center in Capitol Hill, a building Catherine had funded through a Langford Meridian Foundation. Emmett ran the center, the job every previous position had been preparing him for, without his knowing the preschool teaching and the family coordination and the child development work and the nannying, not a series of jobs that didn't fit, but a sequence each adding a skill the final position required. Margaret sat in the back row of Juni's class on a Saturday in October, where she had been sitting every other week for 6 months. Her hands moved through basic signs, stiff, approximate, glacial, but moving. At 67, after a lifetime of certainty, the trying was its own arrival. She signed, "I love you," to her grandchildren at dinner now. The sign was slow. The children received it with the tenderness of people who understand what the effort costs and honor it silently. Anna flew from Boston monthly. Her ASL had reached conversational fluency through a year of intensive classes and weekly video calls with Uni conducted entirely in sign language, a rule Uni established and enforced with the benevolent ruthlessness of an 11-year-old teacher who will not accept less than full effort. Marcus came to the center's open house every year, his signing now competent enough to volunteer as a classroom assistant on Saturday mornings, the man who had said yes without hesitation when Emmett needed him most, still saying yes. 3 years later, in a different form, the form of a friend who had watched a family assemble itself from unlikely parts and had decided to remain part of the architecture. Catherine was fluent, not student fluency. Parent fluency, messy and fast, full of shortcuts and inside jokes and improvised signs that develop within families who live in a language daily. She argued with Wren about bedtime television in sign language. She helped Theo with homework in sign language. She received Margot's increasingly opinionated artistic commentary in sign language. On Tuesday evenings, she and Emmett sat in the kitchen after the children slept and talked in a mixture of signing and speaking that had become their natural mode, two adults who had built something neither planned and neither could imagine dismantling. The center's annual open house fell on a Saturday in November, 3 years and 4 months after Emmett walked into a job interview with a coffee stain and a daughter's instructions in his chest. The building was full. Uni led a children's session, 11 years old and commanding. Wren was her assistant, 8, now signing at a speed that made even Junie work to keep up, the two operating as a unit with the ease of best friends who share a language and a household and a frequency. Emmett stood at the back, Catherine beside him. Their 4 children distributed across the room in the pattern their personalities created, Theo near structural displays, Margot at the art table, Wren and Uni leading, communicating, filling every space with language. Around them, dozens of families, parents learning to sign, children being met in their language for the first time. The skills we build for love do not stay contained to the relationship that made them. They radiate. They find the people who need them in places we could not have predicted, through doors we did not expect to open. Emmett had learned sign language for Junie in a small apartment with a baby who could not hear his lullabies and needed him to find another way to sing them. And the finding had taken 8 years, and the practice had become fluency, and the fluency had walked into a room where 3 children sat in silence and opened a door nobody else could open. The skills we carry quietly show up at the exact moment they are needed most, in the exact form they are needed in. That is not coincidence. That is what love looks like when it has had enough time to become something permanent, something transferable, something that belongs not just to the person who built it or the person it was built for, but to everyone who will ever need it. That is what love looks like when it has had enough time to become fluency.